So just as kind of like a brief recap, we sort of ended at the point where you have basically like papal and imperial, quote-unquote, authority sort of flipped. So you now have like ecclesial authority recognized as like higher, superior to like the crown. And that's something it's a unique tension in Christian life. It's something that's particular to Christians because it's something that comes from Christ. Christ is one who said, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God." That's not something, that kind of division, that sort of scope of like two sort of authorities that have their own rules, their own areas of operation, their own sovereignty in a sense, is not something that others have. That's not something that like was inherited from Judaism. That's something that again is unique to us. It's not something like you go through like Jewish or Muslim religious law, there's an awful lot of like civil instructions in there as well. There's not a lot of civil instructions in what Christ gives. The commands that come like in a Christian sense are ones that have a weight that then has consequences that have to be worked out in like a civil sphere, but they aren't ones that like are, it's not like you will have elections every 4 years kind of a thing, or like this is how you have a magistrate over you. It's basically like wherever you are, be a Christian, and then allow that to sort of influence whatever is going on in whatever way it is. So it's something, again, it's particular to Christians. And in the West, of Western Europe, in the Western part of the Roman Empire, it's more acute because in the East, there's still Caesar. There's like a literal Caesar in Constantinople. So, like, there's not really a whole lot of question, like, who has the authority? Like, it's obvious, he's there. Whereas that kind of imperial authority dissolves, and then you have a whole bunch of, like, regional ones. And they are both the threat and also the promise of order. So they are, like, the invading Gothic peoples. And yet they're also the ones that come in and they establish an order and they provide a context then for like the church to function. So there is a way in which they have an authority, but it's not like this kind of grandiose authority like the sun in the sky kind of a thing like you have like in Constantinople, where there's no question. There's still a bit of competition because there are like bishops who sort of gain power because they're sort of on the fringes. There's not a whole lot of oversight. They sort of have to take up like they've got invaders coming in, they've got people in need, so they sort of step up. So that's where you get kind of like territorial, like baron bishops and things like that, where they like raise armies and do things because they are taking over a role because of a void. They're not taking over it because it's like their proper thing. And eventually, like those go away, and you have the secular thing. So that tension exists. It stays sort of basically with crown over mitre, for like the largest part, simply because of protection. Like there is a need for safety, there is a need for order, and like civil authority, military power is able to provide that. Then you have in the reform movements, kind of with particularly like coming to a head with Pope Gregory, then you have things flip around. And then you have like Henry IV, the Holy Roman Emperor, kind of standing barefoot in the snow. Then you have like the flip. So now you have like church authority superior to ecclesial one. And in an objective sense, that is the proper ordering of things. That's why the reformers were pushing for this. It wasn't so that then you can like get rid of the emperor. It's not like, so now, okay, we have like a super emperor in the form of the Pope over everything else. The Pope is still not like raising armies outside of like, again, where he has like limited territorial authority. Like there is still just this sense of, okay, there is a moral authority that then is able to judge like the temporal. So you have like the eternal is able to judge the secular. So that basically comes to a head, and we see like that's in an objective sense the proper ordering of things, but we don't live in an objective reality. We live in a messy, fallen world. So as that comes to the fore, then even within the church, rather quickly there start to be people pointing out problems in like the way in which this is being actualized. And that's where you get particularly like the birth of mendicant orders, like the Franciscans and the Dominicans come about in large part as reform movements within the church. They are trying to not only just like do good on their own, but they also then provide an example. They provide like a way of living out a Christian life in a more authentic, rooted way that then like gives witness to that then calls people to respond, to act differently, to be able to do something else. And you see, like, on the other hand, you have like ambitious people seeing the authority that the church will have, then try to use that authority to gain power. And from that, then you have kind of like mission creep, and that's where you get like people like taking over church offices, not like to advance like the moral life or in the Christian life, or recognizing a greater like duty to be able to offer it, but because it gets them better seats in the opera or something like that. So there's a material benefit that starts to accrue to these things, and then there becomes a power associated with that. And kind of like the quintessential like two examples of it are that there's canon law, there's church law, and then you have like canonical courts that are set up, because it's okay, well, like civil authority can't prosecute clergy because clergy are beholden to this other law, so they kind of are exempt from certain prosecutions and things. And if they are guilty of something, well, they need to be tried in an ecclesial court rather than in like a local court. And in some sense, there's a reason, there's a rationale, there's a logic behind it, but it's obvious that it's rife with abuse. Like it's very easy, we've seen it kind of in recent decades, like it's easy to kind of like cover things up, hush things away if you kind of have your own private sort of like channel for everything to go through. And then the other one is the selling of indulgences, which again, in an objective sense, if we think of it just theoretically, okay, you are making a material donation. You are offering a sacrificial gift, like as we are able to do, like as Christians, as people who have priestly dignity, like through the baptism of Christ, like we are able to do something. So by giving, by offering, then we are able to make of that a sacrifice. And then in that then, okay, having offered that sacrifice, like the Lord offers something to us. Like it frees us up from that. Again, that's reasonable. Then it becomes, okay, well, I need to buy something. And then it's like, okay, well, I'll do this bad thing, and then I'll just like buy like a get out of jail free card kind of a thing. And that becomes just a transactional sort of a thing. So again, it starts off in abstractly something that's still reasonable, and then it becomes something that becomes abused. So the reform begins to start to like poke at that, whether it's in like the large sort of like mass movements, whether they're in the like the mendicant orders, whether it's in different like popular sorts of assemblies and things that have grown, or like you'd have certain preachers that would go around and kind of like, we would have like parish missions. They would go like on a circuit from that, and there would be just a general sort of reform fervor that would take place in a local area because of that. Then you also get a few oops, I forgot to keep advancing these. Then you get a few of the ones that they are like singular reformers. They're people who like begin to have like a following around them, and those tend to sort of like fall into like two categories. Either they can become saints, like Francis Dominic, or they go too far. Like they start off, they have like maybe this one thing that they recognize as a wrong, and they push it so hard that they begin to push outside of where they should be, and then that focus colors everything that they see. Then they begin to see, okay, well, if people who are doing this, that is wrong, well, then it becomes, well, these people are wrong. And then it becomes, well, whatever these people represent, the system is sort of wrong. It becomes rotten. So then it becomes now the church is the problem rather than the church is sick. And those are the differences between like sort of reformers and counter-reformers. Like the reformers end up being the ones who basically say, okay, so there's something defective, there's something wrong with the church, rather than the ones who say the church is sick and she needs healing. And so that's kind of the distinction that sort of plays out and causes really the rupture that comes from that. So that brings us to Luther and the Reformation. Luther starts off as he's just a very hyper-scrupulous Augustinian monk. He is someone who is very particular and very aware of his own personal sin, to a point where it becomes something that he can't like act without recognizing that something is defective and something's wrong. And in that interior awareness, he's also then hyper aware of sort of what's going on around him. Like by being aware of like his own brokenness, he also recognizes it and sees it reflected in the world. And he's rightly scandalized by, particularly kind of like with the selling of indulgences, with a lot of sort of the avariciousness of the clergy, the overly secular clergy, the kind of like desire for power and authority. And he's a very intelligent man, and he's also one who's very good with a turn of phrase. Not just in terms of like nice quips, which he is very good with, but like just his command of the vernacular is such that like modern German is basically like Luther. It's like his invention, the same way that kind of like modern English like comes sort of filtered through Shakespeare, kind of like modern Spanish comes filtered through Cervantes, like Italian through Dante. There's all of these ones who kind of like, Luther is the one who sort of codifies like what it means to speak German, in part because of the Bible, but also because he's just very eloquent in a German way and is able to sort of get at like the heart of like what it means to kind of like express the people. So he's able to offer critiques in a way that are more palatable, they're more acceptable, they're more able to be understood by the people that he's around. Like not just in general, not just kind of like in the schools or kind of like on a rarefied academic level, but just on the streets. Like the people are able to understand what he's getting at. And because of that, he's able to sort of like sell things better. Again, we're skipping over a whole lot. So this is going to be sort of like almost cartoonish in the way in which we kind of like run through everything, but just want to, again, give a very high level kind of sketch of everything, and so we can, because any one of these points could be like its own 2-hour thing. But basically, kind of with all of that, you then have, there's both I don't want to make it just seem like it's like a pure power play. Like there are people who are honestly like committed, like in faith to what is happening. But as with all things, like power starts to come into it. And Germany is particularly sort of ripe for this because it's so divided, because there is the union under the empire, but it's a very loose one, and you've got all the little principalities scattered throughout, and each one of them, they're always conflicting with each other. And so there's all this ripe opportunity for like ones to try and one up each other, and they're always trying to find like one other way to do it. And this becomes another lever that then you can have the local authorities start to try and pry themselves away both from the authority of the emperor, but also from the authority of Rome, because they've sort of had like these two emperors sort of like sitting over them, and they don't like having like one, so they definitely don't want two. So it becomes a way of sort of distancing themselves from both and playing off one off the other, and then also playing off like their neighbor from like the other neighbor. So it becomes this mess of political machinations as well that then feeds into a lot of the religious fervor that is sort of underpinning it, and then it provides like a political base for the different groups. So that's where you have like the different principalities will start dividing off into like Lutheran or Catholic. So it becomes something that's divided within. That then is something comes out right at the same time as finally we have like movable type, so you have ideas can spread a lot more easily. It's the same time again as sort of a vernacular for like the major language groups in Europe is really getting solidified, and that's also why kind of they get fixed sort of again around the same time with these like major figures. And so then you have what had been sort of a unified Western Christendom, now it splits off into all of these different fragments. That's where you have like the Lutherans, the Calvinists, the Huguenots, and the Anglicans. And the Huguenots largely sort of go away. There's a bit, we have a little bit of an influence on them in this country because they were in France, they sort of moved up north, and a lot of their thought influenced a lot of the Pilgrim movement that eventually kind of came over this way. So you have, again, That's a super, super simple, maybe unhelpfully simple sketch, but that's all we got time for. So then, kind of, there's the Catholic response to this. And that there's two general responses. The first one is that, yeah, there were things wrong. There are things wrong, and they need to be fixed. So there are reforms, like simony and all of that, like the selling of offices. There's a clampdown on secular authorities, sort of assigning bishops and different things, and again, like a drawing back into Rome. And then there's also, in kind of like, okay, internally we need to get our house in order. But to know what needs to get in order in the house, like the key things for a house, other than the floor, are really the walls. Because that delineates, okay, everything in here is in the house. So now we know what to get in order, and then we can cover it, then we can furnish it, then we can do all the kinds of things. So there is an attempt, consciously, deliberately, to try and set, okay, where are the borders? Like, what does it mean to be a Catholic? Like, specifically, like one who, like, in this sense, in kind of, a parody sort of thing, is like loyal to Rome. Like, what does that look like? So that's where you get a lot of the, like, push in Trent, particularly, is to define things. And so that really establishes kind of like the borders for things. It establishes an identity. It concretizes, like, okay, what does it mean to be Catholic? All of those are very good. But the problem that we're still living with, the fallout that kind of continues down the centuries from that, is that then by making it us and them, then you have an actual them. Then you have something alien. Then you have something foreign. Then you have an other. Then you have this thing that isn't us. And that identity and that other identity, or an unidentity in a sense, kind of like not being like not being familiar, not being like a part of the house, then makes that hostile. It makes it something over there. So that's where a lot, and again, those are things that we've like inherited. It's still even in kind of, maybe not on, again, like high level sorts of ecumenical things, but even in just like general interactions, it can be something where it still is something alive and well, where it is like, okay, there's this other, and they become, because we know this other, then like they become a point of hostility. The distinction with this and the East and West schism is that the schism with East and West is not fundamentally doctrinal. It's not about like what it means to be a church, or to be the church, or who Christ is, or what our relationship is with him, or who we are, or what we are, which are all sorts of questions that come up like with the reformers and the various splinterings that come from that. East and West is largely just administrative. It's, okay, well, who has authority over whom, kind of a thing, and how do we relate to each other in that authority? So there's not a denial of sacraments, there's not a denial of, again, like the nature of things, whereas there's theological distinctions that are at play in the Reformation. So that then leads to its commonly called kind of like the wars of religion. And it's not really a good description of them. It just pops up in history books largely because they're kind of post-Enlightenment history books, and religion's a bad thing. So it's a way of kind of like characterizing them as just like, okay, well, look, religion caused all this conflict and it's a problem. And that, we'll see kind of later, that sort of plays into the narrative of like the next sort of phase in which that kind of becomes part of their self-identity. But basically you have, again, it's not just about faith. It's all about these different principalities playing each other off of each other. Like there's conflicts between, like, within the Holy Roman Empire, like with different groups. There's like macro conflicts between like France and Germany, or Spain and Britain. So you've got all these different things going on, and they become sort of like, it's easy to sort of get people involved if you make it about something that is important to them. And so by inflaming a lot of the religious sort of conflict. And again, everyone's trying to establish an identity. Okay, what does it mean to be a Calvinist? It's like, okay, well, we know what those people are. We're not them. Well, then that kind of sets us up already for a combat. That sets us up for aggression. And so that happens, and that continues to fracture Europe. But as that happens, you also then have opportunities and problems come up. So some of the just like the basic fundamental problems are like, okay, well, if your neighbor is Lutheran and you're Catholic, or vice versa, you probably don't necessarily want to like be super involved in them. Like you don't necessarily want to be like getting all of your wheat or something from them. Like if you can't do, you're short on something. So you look to somebody else. So it begins to sort of shift the kaleidoscope of alliances and people who were allied to each other and like where you go for things. And it just complicates things because now you're kind of more willing to, okay, even if you will trade with someone, you're also willing to kind of like gouge them a little more, like because they're kind of the other again. So you'll jack up the price, you'll increase the tariffs, it becomes more of a problem. So everything just gets more expensive. And then you also just have a general idea, particularly for the people kind of like on the end of the line. Like if you're trying to get silks from China, like you've got to get it all the way like along the Silk Road, and then you've got to get it like either it sort of takes a ship and then goes to like Italy, or it goes overland through the Byzantines, then it goes like all through Europe, and it finally gets to like England, and it's very expensive because you've got to like pay all of these people. So every time it goes through somebody else, the price increases. So the people at the end of the line, who are kind of like the Atlantic countries, they're like, well, this isn't good. And so they start looking for alternatives. And they can't rely just kind of like on the good faith of others, because some of them, they're in opposite camps to each other. Like you can't really, like the English and the Spanish can't really count on each other, and they don't. So they end up fighting each other. But they also start looking for other ways. So that begins to have, like in kind of like overland groups of like Italian things, kind of like Marco Polo, like going and looking, okay, how do we set up our own caravan operations to be able to go directly to China and India and to bring back spices and goods and things, and so that then we're sort of in control of the whole thing so we can keep the prices down. Or kind of you're on the Atlantic side of things, it's like, okay, well, we've got ships, like let's use them and let's figure out how we can get over there. So that's how you get like the Portuguese going that way. Eventually you have the Spanish coming over. And you've got all of this sort of like economic activity going on. And there's still like religiously minded people running around, and they're going with them. And some of the like, it's not necessarily they're only out there just to like make some gold. Like there is also an attempt to like also recognize, okay, well, we have a mission still, because there is still, it's an age of more religious fervor. So you have also like other people coming with these. You have some of the new kind of like there was the Formation order, the Reform orders that came up like in the 12 and 1300s. Now there's like another rash of them, and kind of like the Jesuits are sort of like the big model for that. They're part of that reform drive to both initially sort of shore up the borders, kind of like, okay, what can we hold? Like who can we like make sure? Like that's partly why Poland remains Catholic, like is because like the Jesuits sort of like rush in there and like really kind of like hold the fort on that intellectually, and then like culturally the place is able to stay Catholic. Well, the walls are now kind of secure. We've got that settled. Then there's now other places to go that we hadn't really thought of before. Like now, like, okay, like China is open again, India is open again. There are like already Christians, ancient Christians in some of them. There's like little pockets of Nestorians like in China. The southern India, the church down there technically predates a lot of the like Hindu movement down there. So you've got in some places you have active like Christian churches who have been separated, and then part of that is like in India it's reunification. It's not so much like conversion initially; it's like reunification down there, and then there's more in the north and the central pushes for more mission work. China sort of is just very open, and you have even like Japan, and then you've got like whole new continents that come open on our end of things. And then like with the conquest, then you have, again, the Spanish start bringing like people to settle it, people to control it, to organize it. Then you have orders start coming in to evangelize there. And that really begins it's kind of comes to a head with the establishment in Rome of the Propaganda Fide, which is like it's now, I think they just changed the name. It was the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith. It's like, I think it's now like but I think it's the Dicastery for Evangelization or something. They like just changed the name last month. But it's one of those things. It's like, oh, okay, it's a like bureaucratic kind of a thing. It's 500 years old. Like it comes around like again from Trent, and it was an office established kind of like, we've got all these new horizons with all these new people. We need to not just kind of like, oh yeah, when people decide to go out there, like, no, we need to, as the church, sort of begin pushing out. Because up until then, like there had been like an initial sort of spread of Christianity, and then things had just kind of like settled in as kind of like the nations sort of established themselves kind of around 1,000. And by then you've kind of got things sort of spread, and they only spread sort of like as those nations grow. And now, the nations aren't really necessarily doing that, but you have now, there's a deliberate push like from headquarters to really galvanize people to not just say, okay, well, just kind of stay home and do your thing, but also go out and do something. And that has, again, could go into forever on all of that and all kinds of interesting ones, but just kind of like to highlight one. Like in China, you can see kind of the two approaches to evangelization that we still have and the tension between the two of them. And you have the Jesuits who go over and they try and sort of like present themselves like as Chinese. Like they figure out like I think when they first go there, they start dressing like as Taoists because they think, oh, and then they realize like, no, they're on the outs with the court. So then they like wear Confucian garb to sort of, again, ingratiate themselves into the court. And it succeeds. And then they try to sort of like incorporate like what the people are already doing into a Christian context. So it's like, okay, so there's like honoring like your ancestors. It's like, okay, well, can we change that instead of like praying to the dead to praying for the dead? And so we still have sort of like the ritual and the form and all of that and sort of things with that, but how do we like change it into something else? You have the Franciscans who come in, and they basically look at things, and it's like, well, no, what they're doing is wrong. It's like these heathen practices. We need to correct them. And it's called the Chinese rites controversy, because you have sort of like in the same way that we, like, okay, there's the Latin rite of the Roman Church. There's 3 rites within the Roman Church. There's the Ambrosian, the Mozarabic, then there's like the 22 other churches. A lot of them share different liturgies, like there's the Syriac liturgy, there's the Byzantine liturgy, there's all of those kinds of the rites that are part of those. So what's starting to happen is an organic shift in kind of like a Chinese rite that's beginning to form. And then there's the controversy sort of like goes back to Rome. And it's basically like the Jesuits versus the Franciscans. Like, okay, which way should we go with this? Which way should we approach? It ends up at the time, because it's in a European context, right after the Reformation, where you've got all these things splintering off, and everyone is like terrified that if anything is done differently, then it will begin to like morph away. So it's like, no, we need to be, that's kind of why Trent is, and the liturgy that comes from Trent is very like, you do this, you do this, you do this, you hold your hands this way, they're not far that, it's very specific so that everything is uniform, so that you know where the borders are and where everything is. So the idea of something sort of as an innovation, even if it's an organic one, is seen as a threat. And so it ends up the Franciscans are the ones that win out, and the Jesuits sort of lose on that one. And that does, long term, it's one of those things, it does sort of hurt the evangelical efforts in China. But sort of that's just kind of the way that history has played out. then we get to kind of, with that, kind of talking about like the Enlightenment, there's certain periods that try to be very emphatic that they are not the one right before them. Like, they're the ones who say, like, whatever came before us was different. It's kind of like putting a wall in between. So you have, like, the Renaissance. Like, these people, they go back to, like, the pagan ideas of Rome. You have this focus on humanism and sort of a desacralization of things that's going on. And so they say, oh, well, those Gothic people, kind of like being disparaging to, like, the people who came in and invaded Rome, so to speak. So it's like, oh, the Middle Ages. It's kind of like that barbarous time. And we are sort of like we're recovering true civilization. We're getting back to the ideals of the classical civilization. So then you have, like, the Enlightenment does the same kind of a thing. Because obviously, like, well, if we are in the period of light, well, obviously prior to this was dark. So it's a self-ascribed definition. And it's a way of basically saying, like, okay, like, we are the ones who now know, and these others did not. And again, to be sort of like cartoonish in the description of them, there's basically just like three general trends. So there's humanism, which again has its origin like in the late medieval, and it basically is considering like man as such. It's just kind of like, okay, well, like instead of like working from like necessarily always an eternal thing, it's like, okay, what is here? What does man do? What does he have? What does he act like? And then orienting things around human needs, which is not, in a certain sense, bad. Like there's definite space for that sort of understanding. Like that is not a bad thing. It begins actually as like a Christian reform, kind of like to get out of just like a rarefied abstract thing and to get back down into kind of an authentic, lived sort of a thing. But problem with all the reform things is there is the chance you can like be pushing so far you kind of like go off the cliff. And what happens, because then it makes man the measure of all things rather than the point of relation. So it makes like, okay, like I then become like the center of everything and everything sort of fans out from me rather than me being part of like this thing that is already there. Then there's rationalism, which again has origins in the medieval, which is again partly why the Enlightenment is so trying to say, well, we're enlightened and they're dark. It's because it's like, well, no, we came up with this. It has absolutely nothing to do with all of the people who came before us that we read all their stuff and learned all this stuff from. It's about us. But it comes again from the Aristotelian bent of thought, which opened philosophers up to sort of a more evidentiary-based knowledge rather than just like rational knowledge. Like Aristotle did not nearly get everything right, but he did. He went around and looked at stuff. He tried things. He messed with things. He experimented not in a what we would consider a scientific way, but in an evidentiary kind of thing. He focused on experience. So that knowledge is not just like what we can discern as true, just as such, but it begins again with stuff. And again, that's not a problem, but again, it becomes a problem when it becomes the exclusive way in which you can know. And that's really what rationalism is. It's like any knowledge has to be demonstrated, and anything that can't be demonstrated, not that it can't be proven, but that it can't be demonstrated, is then not knowledge. And that really caught on with people's imaginations and attention, particularly because like there's a lot of things new all of a sudden happening. There's like new, like in terms of just geography, there's new lands to go to, there's new people to see, there's new animals that are there, there's all these kind of new things, there's new technology that's coming, that's sort of accelerating and being able to spread. There's new kinds of knowledge that then become like the product of that. So it seems to give like evidence of basically like, okay, if it's not science, then it isn't something really worth dealing with. Then you have secularism, which again, kind of as mentioned at the beginning, it's a uniquely Christian problem. And then it has, because it's coming from a Christian context, even from people who like say they aren't Christian or kind of like post-Christian or whatever, that it's a Christian solution. Because it's like, okay, well, you push Christ to the side. It's like, okay, if like we see all these problems coming from like the sphere, which again is something that like we as Christians have sort of defined, well, then we'll just kind of shove that spear off to the side, and we'll make this one the dominant one. So it gets back to, instead of just a political power play between like ecclesial and secular authority, then it becomes sort of an interior power play as well, just over like the mind and heart of a person. So all of the excesses of all of these, because all of these aren't necessarily like in every single philosophe or in every single like person of the Enlightenment, but these are just kind of like general trends that kind of like, if you just say Enlightenment, these are kinds of the things that generally sort of like surface as an idea. And they reach their apotheosis in the French Revolution, but they don't end with it, because there's the attempt to elevate man to a kind of divinity, but at the same time to reduce humanity to just one more material component among all these other material components. So there's this weird tension where there's like this sort of poetic sort of elevation of like the dignity of humankind, and yet there's also the denigration of the reality of that by basically saying, well, it's just kind of like a slightly like more complicated animal. This is largely just like a political shift here, but it does have consequences like in the church. So Napoleon is sort of the response, or depending how you look at it, the completion of the revolution. And he was the only one, at the time at least, who could and did harness the revolution in a way that was more sustainable than the revolution itself. The revolution itself, you can like go through, like Robespierre and all that, burns itself out literally. Like Robespierre ends up at the guillotine as well. Whereas Napoleon is able to sort of like harness all of that energy and to be able to direct it to something constructive. So the French Empire itself, and then the expansion wars that sort of go over the whole continent, are him being able to take advantage of that drive for something new, that drive to sort of remake things, and not try and like remake the calendar or like remake like the time or those kinds of things, but to just remake the map. Like, let's get back to something like that we can actually manage to do, and to redo Europe in sort of a more rational way, rather than just kind of these traditional things that have been there. So from him, like, Europe is just completely like shifted, and a lot of our, again, like contemporary sort of realities in Europe go back to him and the way that was done. The Holy Roman Empire is dissolved under him. So a lot of the sort of ancestral things are taken away, and it begins a shift, again, particularly kind of with revolutionary France, because it's no longer just to kind of like the people, the land, the king. Like, it is now an idea of what it is to be French. So it's not just like France is the land of the Franks, or it's not like the kingdom that is ruled by the king of the Franks. Now it becomes like a separate identity in and of itself. It becomes something that people actually feel like a part of and folded in and will fight and die for. And that's really like the main shift that comes from that, because that then will push a lot of the like national movements that take place. So it's like that's where you get the idea, instead of like, okay, well, I'm like this prince in Bavaria in like this little valley kind of a thing, to being part of Germany, or kind of like, okay, like I'm a Venetian, I'm from Milan, to like, well, I'm an Italian kind of a thing. Like there's now this push for centralization, which will end up in like the wars for unification that will come largely in the 1800s. So then, kind of to shift back to the church, part of the reason why there's not generally a whole lot kind of like that we see if we just kind of look from like the outside looking in at the church is some of that's deliberate. Because again, there's this idea of being under threat. Like initially there's the threat of like the reformers, then there's the threat of like all the political turmoil that comes up. Then from that comes the threat of all of these new like philosophies that are coming up from like French coffee houses and things. And these are like, then all the revolutions start happening. So there's never like a moment to really get your feet under you. And the church is set up right now, like post-Trent, is set up to basically hold ground kind of within Europe and to make sure that the core identity of like what it is to be Catholic remains consistent. So Baroque Catholicism is really a solidification of that and a codification, and it begins to focus on maintaining an order so that it's able to continue to be coherent in the midst of a world that seems to be kind of like spiraling away, that no longer has this sense of cosmic order and unity that you had in like the High Middle Ages. Now you have the church kind of in a threatening world, having to sort of like bolster herself up from within. And there's one liturgical commentator. He's interesting because he's one of those. He wrote on both sides of the council, and he's one of those. He sounds like this big like liturgical reformer when he's writing in like the before the council, and he sounds like this like arch conservative like liturgical person like on the and he hasn't changed anything. It's simply just kind of like the tone has shifted. But his perspective on it, he says that the benefit of kind of like that liturgical solidification in particular that took place during like the Baroque period is, he says, it preserved the church in amber. And he said it's not just kind of like now like it's stuck, but it's like now in here it's preserved so that then once things are less threatening, once you can kind of stop, catch your breath, then you have this core that has this whole rich treasury that is then able to be brought like alive basically into the present. So instead of like being buffeted by everything, so his view is that the sort of entrenchment that goes on is not always necessarily negative. We think of it as just kind of like, okay, well that's bad, that's kind of retrograde or whatever. But he's like, well no, it has a benefit so that then once things have reestablished themselves a bit, then you have something that you can work with. And kind of an example of that is the fact that there are no ecumenical councils between Trent and the First Vatican Council. So you have 300 years without an ecumenical council, which is the longest span like in the history of the church. So there's not, it's like, there were a lot that were even saying, kind of when Vatican I was called, the first, it was like, well, do we need one? Like Trent answered everything, kind of a thing, because that was kind of its point. It was supposed to basically just, it's all encompassing, it covers everything, kind of, we don't need to have any other questions answered. Obviously, that was not the opinion that carried the day because there were then a First and a Second Vatican Council after that. But you have, as we get into kind of the 1800s in particular, there's a lot of like historical and archaeological work that begins to be done on the ancient world in a more scientific way that also then like sheds light on a lot of not only just like the ancient world in general, but also of the church. Like that's where we find, that's where like a lot of the patristic documents like are uncovered. Like whether they're actually, some of them are like dug up, like on papyrus in jars, whether some of them, they're just found in monasteries. Like they had been like copied and like people had never like read them again. Like they were just kind of like on the shelf, and you find things from like the 200s and 300s that like they've been copied. Maybe they aren't high in rotation for when they get redone, but they're just sitting there. So now you have people who are interested in this sort of thing, and they're finding them, and they're translating them, and they're bringing them to light. So there is now a new examination of things, and there's trying to not just say, okay, well, like this is kind of like the way things have always been. But it's like, okay, well, let's see how things did develop, so that then we sort of like understand how we got to where we did. And there's a few fruits from that. And the first one is just called the liturgical movement. And it's mainly around the Abbey of Solesmes, which I believe had been burned during the Revolution, and then a Benedictine abbot, Prosper Guéranger, reestablished it, and it became if you know about Solesmes at all, now the only thing you know about it really is chant. It is like the kind of like expert on Gregorian chant. They publish a lot of it, but it's the reason for that is because like the theory of it really developed from there, because again, you have all of these texts, you have people who have been doing these things for the past 2 or 3 centuries, but sometimes things had gotten a little difficult, or they didn't quite understand why they were doing them, so they just stopped. I had a Cistercian professor who had studied in Paris, and he had studied at Solesmes actually, and he talked about how his first doctorate that he did was on the Cistercian chant, and he said that looking at the book, he's like, why is it like none of this makes sense in any kind of musical theory? And he found out it's like at some point people had realized, like in the monasteries, it's like, well, this is kind of hard. Like it's a little too high, too early in the morning, or it's a little too low. And so it's like, well, let's just kind of squish things down and just make it simple. And it doesn't sound right, but that's like in 200 years no one will notice, and no one did. Until he came along, was like, well, why did they do it? And he went back, and it was like, someone was like, well, okay, this is hard. And then they looked in the Psalms, and it talks about like on the 10-stringed lyre. And it's like, okay, well, there should only be 10 notes, so that's all we're going to use. And so that was like the rationale for it. So that's like, again, where that came from. But it was that kind of work that Solesmes was doing. And it started with the chant, but it also then began to kind of go with liturgy itself. And it's not just, okay, like, yes, you do this and you do that and you do this. It's like, okay, well, why? And then commentaries start coming out. And it's like, okay, well, this comes from this. This is, okay, this is an act, like, this is coming from, like in Leviticus it says to do this. Okay, this is why we act like this. This is why this is the propitiate. That's all of these kinds of reasons for why the liturgy is shaped and formed, and all the different nuances for it came from the liturgical movement. And it was designed to recover, like, okay, what was done, so that then we can enrich what we're doing now. So that then you're able to both, like, as the priest, be able to, like, enter into it in a more deliberate way, but also as the faithful, be able to enter into it in a more deliberate way, to see what's going on, to recognize what's there, and to act appropriately based off of that, so to allow it to shape things. So that's kind of the liturgical movement. Then the second one was the First Vatican Council, and it's best known for defining papal infallibility, but it was originally convoked to describe the Church, as all councils up until like this one had been, basically to kind of like, okay, there are problems, and there are new problems, because that's where it's like, okay, well, there are new things that have happened since Trent. Like, there are, not just in terms of like historical events, but new thought that is. So like rationalism, liberalism, secularism, materialism, they kind of like go through all of them, define what they are, define why they're bad, and then define kind of like, okay, what should the church be like against these? And that's part of it. Then there is papal infallibility is part of that. But again, it's part of the relationship of the church in the world, in like the new way in which the world is. Vatican I is a bit odd because it ends early, basically because all of the bishops have to evacuate because Garibaldi is coming in and unifying Italy. And so the papal states are overrun, and that becomes like the confinement of the Pope in the Vatican. And because it's this period where like Italy asserts that they have territorial control over the Vatican, and the Pope says, well, no, you don't, because I'm still in charge of this. But it looks really bad if you come in and storm the Vatican. So like it didn't go over too well with Napoleon, but Napoleon was Napoleon, and he could pull it off. Garibaldi isn't. So he doesn't. So it kind of just is a stalemate actually up until Mussolini. And Mussolini is the one who negotiates the Concordat, where we have like Vatican City established and recognized fully. So that's kind of how Vatican I ends. That comes up later because when the Second Vatican Council is called, when John the 23rd, the first thing when all they meet, they have to get together and figure out, is this a new council or is this a continuation? Because like Trent wasn't just like one session. Like very rarely is a council like just you come together and you stay until it's done. It's like you come together, you meet for a little bit, you go away, you come back. Trent was over years. So the same sort of thing. It's like, is this, we're just picking up where we left off, or is this something new? And it's one of those like, okay, this is different. Like the kinds of questions and everything that are coming up are distinct. So the first act, technically, of the Second Vatican Council is to close the First Vatican Council. Then the Second Vatican Council is opened. Just as a historical note. Then, particularly kind of around the First Vatican Council and then towards the end of the 1800s, the beginning of the 1900s, is neo-scholasticism versus modernism. Modernism is kind of what it sounds like. It's like, well, we need to like update things, and not just like we need to update like our philosophical approach or kind of the way that we talk about things or like how we approach things, but like we need to change the content of things. Like things, this is obviously wrong. The world has moved on and is different, so we need to be different as well. Neo-scholasticism is a response to that, and it goes back to the church's like, again, things have kind of solidified. Scholasticism and Thomism again became kind of just very formulaic. So it's one of those, it's like, okay, well, let's stop just like repeating things and let's actually like really think about these things in the same way that like the scholastics did, in the way that the Thomists did, like going back to, again, not just like, okay, well, let's like put on our 1200 hats and like think like them. It's like the methods in which they used are still applicable now, so let's apply them now and approach these same questions, not just kind of like say, oh, okay, well, this is dumb, we need to move on, but like, well, no, this is true, but maybe we need to understand it in a different way or in a fuller way, like how this is true for now. And that's like the competition between those two really dominates the period in a very strong way between like the two Vatican councils. So then that leads us into kind of the Second Vatican Council. So the sort of unique character of it is that it is not specifically called to address like a specific question initially. Like it's not like going back to Nicaea, it's like, okay, Arians are saying this is wrong, we need to say why, kind of a thing. Or a lot of the ones we sort of like don't really remember, like the Third Lateran or like Constance or something, like they're some of those are very niche questions that come up, but they are a question. The Second Vatican Council is a one that is sort of about its like historical place. Like all councils are historical; they are all products of their time. Like the way in which like certain things are said in the past are not probably the way we would formulate them now. So it's the same sort of thing. That's not a critique. That's not like saying any are better or worse than the others. But there is a historical reality of it. And so the historical character of the council, I think, is important, maybe more so than the others, simply because it's the one closest to us. Because like it, in a sense, has more weight on us because it's simply just the most recent. So the council is, unlike kind of sometimes comes out, it's not just like something completely unique. It's not kind of a new beginning. It's not like a point of break. It is like the most recent ecumenical council. There have been a bunch of them. And so in that sense, it is one of a part of the whole. But it was called just in generally as a time of reflection. Like the First Vatican Council was an assertion of the Church's place in the modern context. The Second Vatican Council is now after 2 world wars, after a lot of the sort of secular assurances are gone. Like, you don't have kind of like, you can go like back like in the early part of the 20th century, like Comte and stuff, like have like positive, like the positivist kind of a thing, like trying to establish some sort of like a secular church, a secular religion, because they're asserting all of these things as true. A lot of those certainties like kind of literally get blown up in 2 world wars. So then things are just, they're a lot more uncertain. Now it's kind of like the depths of the Cold War. So you've got like the nuclear umbrella hanging over everybody. And so it's a product of that. It's not strictly about initially like, okay, we have this idea, we just need to formulate it and give it. It's like, let's stop, let us gather as the church, and let us see who we are, and then let us be able to announce that to the world, like recognizing where the world is as well, like seeing how things are different. And so that's the character of it. And it comes, sometimes it's called like a pastoral council, as if it's like some kind of other sort of a council. It has a pastoral character, all of them do. It just has a pastoral character in that more sort of reflective sense of kind of offering like, okay, well, let's kind of regroup, recenter, get everything, let's us understand ourselves so that then we are able to like reflect that more clearly into the world. That then, again, sounds fine, but the downside to having not sort of like very obvious concrete, like do this, do that kind of a thing, is that then the implementation becomes sometimes up for grabs. People have different ideas of it, and like pressures and tensions come into that. Again, this is not something unique to this council. Trent wasn't fully ratified by all of the bishops of France, I think, until it's like 1640 or something like that. It's almost 100 years after the council, basically. So, like, it's not strange that is like going on even with us. We're less than 100 years out, so there's the problem. So the one problem with it was that some of the assumptions made seem to have been that there was a surer foundation, just sort of like individually among like Catholics, than there maybe was. Like the good thing about like having a wall, kind of as you see where it is, you know that it's there, you know that it's solid. The problem is that if you're focused so much on the wall and not so much as kind of like the furnishing and everything within, there might not, if you remove the wall, then there might not be as much content sort of inside to continue to define what it is. Like if you've got like a city behind a wall and then you've got like farmland, okay, you know where the city is. If you've got cities like we have, like you can kind of be driving and it's like farms, you like come over a hill, all of a sudden you're in the middle of suburbia. Like there's not like a lot of distinction with it. So that seems to be part of it. I remember I was rummaging through the library in Houston. They were getting rid of books at the seminary, and there was one. It was a little pamphlet that was given about it was for the new liturgical year right after the council had concluded. And whoever had it, the pastor, had like made notes in the margin all over it, and they were fascinating to read because the one that really stands out was because it was going through the first reading, and he says, "So is this done from the altar?" ? Because there wasn't even an idea of like, oh, you need an ambo. Like there wasn't that kind of. It was just basically like, here's the book, have fun, kind of like go. And there was an honest trust that people would do it and do it well. But it doesn't seem that always necessarily the formation existed like just in a broad sense to be able to sustain that sort of trust and that push. And again, that is unfortunate. Like, is it necessarily like a bad thing in the long-term scope of things? We'll find out. We're still in the midst of the story and it hasn't ended and we don't know. But that is sort of the thing that then led to kind of like the liturgy wars, particularly of like the 1980s, where you have people kind of really invested in like one thing or the other, or trying to push kind of, you get like, again, the same thing of like the modernist kind of a thing. It's like, well, let's update, let's do something new, let's do something fresh. Let's like, no, let's do what we always have done. And then you've got the, well, let's do what we do in the way that like is present now kind of a thing. So you've got tensions between all of those, and again, they still haven't fully worked themselves out, but you see things kind of calm down generally like over the pontificate of John Paul II, and he sort of, I think in large part, other than just kind of his ability, like the length of time that he was Pope sort of has something to do with it, because it's be able to bring a lot of these disparate kind of things together, maybe not reconciled like into something cohesive, but at least to begin to get something coherent. So it's able to be like something that functions as a whole, even if maybe it isn't always kind of like internally like compatible or coherent with each other. So kind of coming to sort of where we are now, there's, with the new millennium, so entering like the third Christian millennium, there's like particularly right around like the time that there's this like burst of like optimism, where it's, and that's sort of encapsulated and given like a direction, a push with John Paul in what he calls the new evangelization. That idea, it's like, okay, there might not be like new lands that we're discovering. It's not like, okay, we'll go be a missionary on the moon or something like that. But like go maybe to these places that have been Christian, that maybe, again, once the walls were kind of put up, kind of drifted away, and so to recover that identity and to have one to then to be able to bring there, to go and to proclaim the gospel afresh, maybe to people who have heard it, but either have forgotten it or didn't really understand it or didn't really listen or whatever, but to be able to like have again that push to go into do and to act. So then you have, particularly kind of under Benedict, then there's this sort of refinement of like the consensus, kind of the idea of like, okay, well, there needs to be like this real understanding of like where we have been, where we are, so that then we know where we are going. Not just that we are going, but to have a direction to really be able to go in a coherent way, in a way that is able to like really live the faith, to really be able to kind of be something that is evangelical rather than just like something that is preached. Kind of like, okay, well, this is true, or you need to do this or something, but like this is who Christ is, and then to allow the rest of that to kind of flow from that rather than the other way around. That's kind of where we are sort of right now, kind of like in the past like decade, sort of. We've kind of gotten to the point where like the consensus that we sort of have been able to get through kind of like from the council, it's one of those, it's like the good thing is we're kind of seeing like, okay, maybe it isn't as strong as we thought it was. Maybe it isn't as coherent as it should have been. And that's not like, oh no, like everything's going to end. Like that sometimes happens. It's like, oh, the Pope said this, or oh, this is happening. It's like, well, let's get back to kind of who we are, like what is true, and then to kind of like be able to evaluate these things in that light. And that way then it's not kind of like, oh no, like there's always like the next catastrophe, like right over the hill. But it lets us be able to kind of like stay like sane and sober about it, and to say, okay, well, yeah, we are still in a disruptive time, like aside from just like what's going on in the news, like just on like the church's calendar. Again, we're less than a century out from the council. Like there's always like disruptive elements. There's always like schisms. There's always breakaways that happen after them. So this isn't like the fact that we have the same kind of things going on just makes us part of the same story. It doesn't make us unique. It doesn't mean that we're like the last generation or something like that. It just means that things are different because things like are always different. There's always something new. So it's simply just us not being able to just kind of like okay, well, we're done, kind of, we don't have to try anymore. That was kind of some of like the idea that like Trent lulled people into. It's like, oh, I don't have to try. I don't have to, well, it's like, well, no. Part of the new evangelization isn't necessarily always like going out and like doing that. but it's also like, how am I being enriched? Like, how am I allowing myself to be churned up, to allow new soil to be there? And in that, then it helps us, again, like, I think, really concentrate sort of like on the long term. That's kind of just where I want to end, kind of like with this quote, because again, it's important to remember, again, history isn't done. Like, the story isn't concluded. Even when we have to bow out of it, like, the story goes on. And so it helps us, I think, again, kind of like as I began with, like, to be humble in the midst of all of this, so that then we don't think that like everything like relies on us, everything is about us, but we see that we are part of it, and we have a role, we have like a great deal of like gift that's entrusted to us in being able to continue the story, but it doesn't like make everything kind of like end on us and be part of like just end with who we are. So again, I blitzed through that, and it was like, I apologize again, it's cartoonish for centuries, but that was kind of the way just to get to, so we had some time for if anyone had questions